So just recently, I was able to take a trip down to my local game store to play a real-life game of 40k on a real table with real terrain. In this game, I took my Tyranids against some gnarly Necrons. So let's talk about the game and do a play-by-play of what happened. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be doing a bit of a battle report. Going back to my roots, I took some pictures and videos of a recent game that I played at my LGS, and so I'll talk about them and talk about what happened in the game. Let me know in the comments down below if you enjoyed this style of battle report and this style of content. This is what I sort of cut my teeth on in YouTube, and when I came back into 40k in 8th edition last year, I started out with photograph battle reports pretty similar to this. So this is kind of a bit of a callback. And remember, if you enjoy my content and the style of content that we do here on Tactical Tortoise, go ahead, throw us a like on the video, throw us a subscribe down below. It really helps out, and I really super duper appreciate it. But anyway, let's talk about the game and what happened in this game of Tyranids versus Necron. So this was a 2,000 point GT2020 format standard style game. On my end, I was bringing a sort of experimental style of Tyranid list. If you've watched my streams recently, I've been experimenting with a list similar to this that's using Dimacarons. I'm not totally sold on Dimacarons yet. They're kind of hit or miss, but I don't have any in real life, so I substituted them out for some additional guns, which is never a bad thing in Tyranids. The list is composed of a single battalion detachment coming from High Fleet Kronos to buff those guns up. It runs 2 Hive Tyrants as well as the Swarm Lord. The 2 Hive Tyrants both have 2 sets of Scything Talons as well as wings and adrenal glands, and the Scything Talons have all been upgraded to be murderously sized. One of them gets the Residence Barb Relic for +1 to cast and an additional cast. I usually make that one my support caster because the support powers are typically very valuable and I really want to get those off every turn, those being specifically Onslaught and Catalyst in this list. I usually put Symbiostorm on Swarm Lord because while that's very important, it's not quite as crucial as Onslaught, which can really sling those Hive Tyrants way up the table. So I really want the +1 to cast on Onslaught. And the last Hive Tyrant just gets Psychic Scream, so he can come in and smite and do some mortal wounds on the way in to go smash people. Over for troops, I have 3 units of 10 Hormagaunts. They're mostly there to score engageable fronts and complete actions like deploy scramblers. I have 3 units of 21 Termagants. One has one guy with a Devourer, but everyone else has Flesh Borers. So a unit of 6 Hive Guard. For obvious reasons, they're good at shooting, so that's pretty solid. A Lictor, as well as a unit of 3 Venom Thrope. The Venom Thropes are one of the reasons that this list is High Fleet Kronos. High Fleet Kronos is obviously excellent for the guns, but not so good for the Hive Tyrants or all of the Termagants. But if you run a full High Fleet list, that basically unlocks the ability to take a Spore Cloud unit like Venom Thropes or a Malanthrope, because those only affect units of the same sub-faction. So if I were to split into multiple detachments, not only would that cost me CP, but the Venom Thrope unit would not affect the entire army, and they probably wouldn't be worth it. Rounding out the list, I have 2 Exocrines, so pretty straightforward to back up the enormous number of infantry as well as the Hive Tyrants that are going to be bearing down on my opponent, trying to smash them and kill them with psychic powers. Now, list is, like I mentioned, highly experimental. I'm not super sold on it yet, to be honest. I really like the Hive Tyrants, but I think I'm biased because Hive Tyrants are one of my favorite units in the game to play. They eat a ton of CP. You usually need to be Voracious Appetiting and overrunning them constantly to keep them alive. You also have to be rerolling invulnerable saves so they don't take too much damage, but in the era of super high AP, high efficiency weapons like Eradicators, having an invulnerable save as your main defense rather than toughness or an armor save value is way better, and those guys tend to survive a lot longer than I typically would expect them to. With the switch of Space Marine armies to focusing on Gravis armored troops, I find Hive Tyrants have been pretty useful as well, because, especially with Murderous Size, their stat line is perfect for knocking out 3-ish wound high armor save infantry. With Voracious Appetite, they can usually get in and convert 100% of their 5 big stabby attacks, so they could potentially just wipe out a unit of like 5 Heavy Intercessors or 5 Eradicators if they need to, and then overrun back to safety. The extra damage as well helps if they have something like an Apothecary to give them a 6+ damage ignore, plus they're really good at killing vehicles if you see those very often. Now, there are some big downsides to the list, and that's really the reason that I am not super happy with it. I think the general theory behind the list is pretty solid. I mean, it's going to do a lot of damage, it's going to be able to take a lot of board space, that's all great. Downside downside is that it's basically a charity when it comes to giving out secondary points. You have 5 monsters, so you're easily bringing it downable. You have 3 Psychers, all of which cannot be lookout served because they're 12 wounds, so you can give out Abhor the Witch super quickly, and you have a big mixture of monsters and almost 100 infantry models, which means that you're easily thinned the ranksable. Your ranks are easily thinned. But I think generally I like the fact that it brings a lot of bodies to score primary objectives. The Hive Tyrants are good at sort of scalping out important enemy units, and then also you have a bunch of guns, which is sweet. Moving over to my opponent's list for today, like I mentioned, they were playing Necrons and bringing a single battalion detachment out of a custom Tomb World. My opponent was bringing the relentlessly expansionist and pitiless hunters dynastic codes so that the entire army would make a 6-inch move before the game, and in addition they basically got bolter discipline for all of their rapid fire weapons, of which there are many. I think this is a pretty sick combo of sub-faction ability, especially since Relentlessly Expansionist allows you to move your infantry up into range where they can then stand still to take advantage of Pitiless Hunters early on in the game. What my opponent was playing for this game were 2 Cryptechs, a Chronomancer as well as a Technomancer, a unit of Cryptothralls, attendant to them as well, a Necron Lord with the Orb of Eternity as well as a Skorpek Lord. Following that up, we have 2 units of 20 blobs of Necron Warriors to make up the backbone, a unit of 10 Death Marks, 5 Immortals to do some backline objective holding, 6 Skorpek Destroyers to supplement the beat stickery of that Skorpek Lord along with their attendant Plasma Sight, a unit of 7 Canoptek Scarabs, as well as a Doomsday Arc and a Doom Scythe. Overall, seems like pretty standard Necron fare. A lot of warriors to make up the backbone of the list and to be very difficult to remove from objectives. I was actually pretty worried about those guys because my list, unfortunately, and Tyranids in general, don't typically bring a ton of infantry clearing, and with as resilient as Necron warriors can be, with the ability to regenerate pretty quickly if you don't wipe out the unit, I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to remove all of them, whereas they could just potentially kill a whole boatload of Termagants over the course of the game. The Doomsday Arc as well is typically a pretty strong artillery piece and outranges Tyranid artillery pretty hardcore. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to take that down. The mission for this game was going to be Scorched Earth, so we have 6 objectives sort of along the 2 flanks of the table. We could potentially do a special action to raise our opponent's objective that are in their deployment zone. That never mattered, so we can basically just write that rule off. Terrain was, I think, pretty standard. 2 forests in each deployment zone, as well as some linear obstacles in the center, and 6 ruins, 2 L's in the center of the table, and then L's in the corners of each deployment zone as well. Now, we did something a little bit special for the L ruins, something that we do typically in my local area, and that I hope that the rest of the community starts to adopt because I think it cleans up play a lot, is that we basically call the walls of the ruin an obstacle that has all of the ruin keywords, so scalable, breachable, obscuring, all that stuff. But the base, which is just basically called just a light terrain, area terrain. What that means is that only the walls of the ruin would actually block line of sight when you're taking that ruin into account, and you would have to move up and touch them in order to see through them or be seen through them. That just cleans up like so much play. You never get a weird situation where like the curb of a ruin blocks line of sight even though there's no wall there. Unfortunately, there are a lot of situations in 40k now that the terrain rules have changed so drastically from 8th edition, where you have communities and LGSs that have terrain that was built with the 8th edition terrain rules in mind. In 8th edition, the base of the terrain only mattered for getting light cover, so it didn't really matter how big of a base you put on your terrain. In 9th edition, if you use the suggested rules for ruins, which are optional, by the way, you can just make up your own rules for your terrain if you want, and I encourage people to do so because I think it's much more interesting, then the entire base of the terrain gets that obscuring keyword, and you get these bizarre situations where someone can, touch the corner of a piece of terrain and then be seen through the building on this side, or that they could be behind this corner and not be seen by somebody, who's not even close to the end, looking over the edge of that wall there. And it just kind of generates feel bads and is, it's generally not the greatest rule ever. Now, if you have ruins where the base of the terrain is very tight to the ruin, and you've designed it with those 9th edition obscuring terrain rules in mind, I think that's great. And I think hopefully as 9th edition matures, new pieces of terrain that are generated or that the community creates will have those rules in mind. But a lot of this terrain was created in 8th edition. No one was considering that the base would ever block line of sight. So in those cases, I do think that the ruins work better as obstacles rather than area terrain. So that's how we're playing them today. So if I talk about the ruins blocking terrain, but I'm touching the base or something like that, please just keep that in mind. In terms of secondary objectives, I have a couple that I'm very much like to take, essentially regardless of my opponent's list. Because most people are very good at building their list so that they can't really be scored kill secondaries against, I usually take Deploy Scramblers and Engage on All Fronts as two pretty easy ones. Because my opponent had 4 characters, my last pick was Assassinate. In hindsight, I don't know if this is the correct pick. Obviously, you can't max it out in this matchup, and characters are typically generally very difficult to take out anyway, but that said, my opponent's list was pretty well formulated. I didn't really have any good picks. There wasn't a lot of vehicles for Bring It Down. He didn't have quite enough infantry for thin their ranks, and even the Necron Warriors I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to kill. Although I did consider thin their ranks because the Necron Warriors regenerate themselves, so you could potentially score multiple times off a single model. So I think it would have changed the target priority to force me to send more attacks into those Necron Warriors and force them to come back to life multiple times so I could kill them. But I figured that wasn't going to be a particularly good game plan, and over the course of the game I was going to be able to take out some Assassinates. Now, like I said at the top, my list gives up secondaries like it's going out of style, so my opponent was easily able to pick thin their ranks, Abhor the Witch, Bring It Down, and really put some pressure on me. Obviously, he was going to be able to kill a ton of Termagants and Hormagaunts over the course of the game. That's easy thin their rank points. All of the monsters also count for thin their rank points, which means that they double score alongside Bring It Down, making them each worth 4 points at the start, and the Hive Tyrants with the Abhor the Witch are then worth 5 points. So, it's a pretty sad day for the Tyranid monsters when they become worth so many freaking points due to secondaries, but I think those were all good picks on my opponent's part. Now, as we began deploying, I realized that essentially in each of our deployment zones, only the ruins on the opposite right and in top left corners would have good coverage to block line of sight from the enemy deployment zone, because the ruins on the left-hand side could be relatively easily circumvented with some movement, and especially this one, if my opponent elected to deploy something big like his Doomsday Ark in this corner and then move it, he could easily see into this ruin here. So I decided to anchor the most of my line off of the ruin on the right-hand flank. So with that in mind, I put the Hive Guard to hide behind that wall, as well as the Venom Thropes back there. You can just barely see him off screen, but Swarm Lord's hiding in the corner as well, so that Doomsday Ark cannot draw line of sight through to him because of all of the obscuring terrain in the middle. Now, without good terrain to block line of sight to my heavy monsters, I just decided to put them all in the dense cover so they would all be -1 to hit, and hope for the best. My opponent elected to put his unit of 10 Death Marks in reserve, so I kept some Hormagaunts sort of back deployed along the back edge of the table so I could use them in the later turns to start screening out the rear of my deployment zone as the Termagants moved more aggressively up. Now, on my opponent's side, my opponent elected to essentially do something similar to what I did, which was anchor his line on the ruin on the right-hand side of his table, but I think he castles a little bit too hard. Now, he has both units of 20 Necron Warriors over there. The Scorpex were hiding behind line of sight, the line of sight blocker on my right-hand flank, so his left-hand flank, next to the Doom Scythe over there, which could basically go wherever it wanted with those aircraft rules. So that meant that we were basically both very heavily concentrated on our right-hand flanks, and we were kind of looking at a base trade situation going throughout the game. So the roll for the turn 1 begins, the all-important roll in 9th edition 40k, and unfortunately I lost the roll to go first, so my opponent elected to go first. With his relentlessly expansionist pre-game movement, he was able to get some stuff in range and push pretty hard up the table. The Doom Scythe, as you can see in the photo here, ran right up into the dense cover in my deployment zone so that it was able to ignore that dense cover. And then fired into my Exocrine and put its smaller guns into the Termagants. It didn't kill too many Termagants, but it was able to remove the Exocrine from the table with 2 3s on its damage rolls to get 2 flat hits of 6 damage through and exactly kill the Exocrine. On the other side of the table, the Doomsday Ark took a shot at the remaining Exocrine and put it down to 3 wounds with some good rolling as well. But otherwise, the small arm shooting didn't do too much. I lost a couple of the Termagants out of the unit on the left-hand side, but that was about it. Moving forward into my turn, my opponent also pushed aggressively forward on my right-hand flank with the Scorpec Destroyers as well as the Scarab Swarms, putting a reasonable number of models onto the objective there. Now moving over to my turn, I think that the placement of the Doom Scythe specifically was maybe a little bit aggressive because I was going to be able to take it out pretty easily. Well, some smites went into the Scarab Swarms as well as the Doom Scythe and did a little bit of damage to it. My Exocrine unfortunately sort of failed me in shooting. I elected not to turn around and fire back into the Doomsday Arc. Unfortunately, the chances that I kill the Doomsday Arc, especially if my opponent decides to enforce his Quantum Shielding to a 4+ invulnerable save, was very low. Even with Pathogenic Slime, I was probably not going to be hitting. So I elected to just turn around and fire into the Immortals here. Now, unfortunately, on the Exocrine's first shot, he only killed one Immortal. So I turned around and put some shots into the Doom Scythe just in case. Did 2 additional damage to it to drop it down to 8 wounds, which meant that my Hive Tyrant only had to put 2 unsaved wounds through on it with its Scything Talons to kill it, and I was feeling pretty good about that. Otherwise, the Hive Guard double fired with Single Bite Annihilation into the Scorpek Destroyers and were able to, I believe, remove the entire unit even through their stratagem for -1 to be wounded. The Hive Guard were rolling ridiculously good this game, and I had Symbiosorm on them since Swarmlord was in the area, so they had a lot of exploding 6s to hit, and just kind of went ham on those guys and blew them all up. I double moved the Hive Tyrant on this side. This picture is before the double move, but he moved into the corner of this ruin here, essentially, so that he could charge into the Scorpex and finish them off if he needed to, or alternatively charge into the Scarabs. The Scorpex, since they died, I elected to charge into the Scarabs, basically charged backwards over top of them, was able to wipe the unit out, and then overrun back out of range of the Scorpek Lord, who was right over here. On the other side, the Hive Tyrant with the Resonance Barb, which was this one, ended up just pulling the flyer right out of the sky and killing it. My opponent elected to use the stratagem to automatically explode it to deal a couple wounds to the Exocrine, as well as the Termagants and Hormagaunts and the Hive Tyrant that were nearby, which was pretty obnoxious, but not much I can do about that. Now, in the second round, my opponent remained relatively defensive, and I think this was probably a little bit of a mistake on his part, and kept most of his Necron warriors back in his deployment zone. He began moving a unit up to Objective 5 on the left-hand side, but the remainder of his army stayed relatively stationary. He was able to finish off the last Exocrine with a shot from the Doomsday Arc, but didn't have any line of sight to the Hive Tyrant, so wasn't able to take shots there. He was also able to finish off one of the units of Hormagaunts on the left-hand side and start picking away at the unit of Termagants there, but they were still alive to score me Objective 1. Now, because the Scorpek Lord was alive and he remained on the objective on the top right-hand side of the table, I wasn't really comfortable with putting models on Objective 3. In hindsight, maybe I should have and just eaten charge from the Scorpek Lord, but the last thing I wanted to do was put a Hive Tyrant there, which was probably the only model who was going to be in range, and get him accidentally killed by that Scorpek Lord, because, I mean, potentially that guy could come in, he's got Thunder Hammers for arms, basically, and can knock a monster off the table with some bad invulnerable saves, and I would not like to see that happen, so I elected to take discretion as the better part of valor. Since my opponent's presence on that side of the table was relatively light, I felt like I could knock it out next turn and start scoring primary points from there. That also scored my opponent 10 points on primary, and gave my opponent a pretty big lead in terms of thin their ranks and bring it down, getting 6 points for killing both of the Exocrines, as well as a couple points from killing the Termagants. Now, at this stage, I knew I needed to take some table space in order to get a lead on primary objectives. Because my opponent was playing so cagey, I knew primary objectives were probably going to be the way to go, especially since with my opponent's lead on secondaries, I wasn't 100% sure that I could make up for that. So I elected to shove a bunch of models forward. I used the Metabolic Overdrive to get the Swarmlord onto Objective 3. That allowed my other Hive Tyrant to move relatively aggressively forward, and then, regardless of how my Psychic phase and Shooting phase went, Swarmlord could then move him into safety or into a more aggressive position if I needed to. What ended up happening is that my opponent's Scorpek Lord on Objective 3 got killed by Smites and Hive Guard, and so Swarmlord was able to just double move that Hive Tyrant behind the ruin on Objective 4. I put a bunch of models on Objective 4, advanced the other Hive Tyrant over, and just generally started taking that side of the table. My opponent didn't really have good lines of sight onto Objective 3, so I was pretty comfortable that I would be able to hold that objective and the objective on my right-hand side of the table to at least score me my 10 points for primary. I did score 10 points for primary at the start of the turn for holding the objective on my left-hand side of the table, but I assumed that was not going to hold for long because those guys were eventually going to get killed by Gauss Flares. I also started to score engage on all fronts this turn, and I scored my second Scramblers action with a unit of Hormagaunts on the right-hand side, doing so in the center of the table. One of the units of Termagants had done that in my deployment zone on turn 1, so I was 2 out of 3 for Scramblers so far. So in my opponent's round 3, they only scored 5 points for primary because I had knocked them off objective 4. But this turn, they decided to bring the death marks in, or I guess they had to bring the death marks in out of hyperspace, and they came in to start shooting at the Hive Tyrant that was hiding behind the ruin on my right-hand side. They were able to deal 5 damage between their mortal wounds and just their standard gunshots, which I was pretty upset about, but that meant that I had something to do on my subsequent turn. Unfortunately, without much lines of sight, my opponent didn't have much else to do. He killed a couple of the Termagants off of my right-hand side. He wiped the Termagants off of my left-hand side to remove my left-hand objective from me, but other than that, that was about it, although my opponent did move aggressively forward to take the center objective on the left-hand side. So at this point, I scored 10 points on the bottom of round 3, and we have begun the base trade situation. We're both sort of using the L's as cover to move pretty aggressively towards each other's deployment zone alongside the 3 objectives on each side of the table. At this point, I began to move my Hive Guard out of the ruin that was on my right-hand side because they were pretty well protected by the obscuring terrain here. I think there were a couple lines of sight where my opponent could potentially see them, but it was mostly from this side of the table, so I wasn't super worried about it. I was able to get a bunch of smites and shooting into the death marks, knock them down to 1 model, which was perfect because my last remaining Hive Tyrant went over and blew that one guy up and then overran back to safety behind the objective just to get rid of those guys. I was able to put my Lictor in the top corner here to score me the full 3 from engage on all fronts and my last point of Scramblers, so I was able to get 10 points for deploy Scramblers. I put Catalyst on a unit of Termagants and ran them up to objective 4. My opponent, unfortunately, I think with an advanced roll, was not able to get to objective 4 with his Immortals because of the difficult terrain that was hampering them, so that was going to make it so I controlled that objective unless my opponent was able to wipe that unit of Termagants out. Now, they are strung back all the way to the Venom Thropes in the back there, so they're -1 to hit and have Catalyst on them. But I was pretty confident they would survive, and if I was going to be able to hold 3 objectives through my opponent's turn, I would get 15 for primary. So I'd be looking pretty good to max my primary out this game. Now, at this point, I also considered sending a Hive Tyrant over into my opponent's lines. I think if I played maybe a little bit more aggressively with Swarmlord, I could have put a Hive Tyrant on objective 4 and then with Onslaught and a double move, advanced it to a pretty aggressive position. And then I think with a charge, I could have engaged 2 of my opponent's characters, the Necron Lord, as well as one of the Cryptex. I did have the CP remaining to Voracious Appetite and then Double Fight to try to get both of them to get me 6 points on Assassinate. But here's the issue. Doing the arithmetic in my head, if I traded a Hive Tyrant for those 2 characters, I would be getting 6 points for Assassinate, obviously, but that's great. But when my opponent kills it, he gets 9 points. 1 point for Thin Their Ranks, 5 points for Abhor the Witch, 3 points for Bring It Down, and it would end up netting my opponent an additional 3 points, essentially, in the trade-off. So that was just a bad trade. In this particular situation, there would be no reason to ever engage with the Hive Tyrant. And that was it was a little frustrating to me. I really want to send my Hive Tyrants in and smash people, but unfortunately, the way the secondaries are broken down, I just can't do that. I can't send a Hive Tyrant in and do work because it just ends up giving my opponent 1 billion points. But I elected to keep the Hive Tyrants back behind the obscuring terrain and keep them safe as long as possible. At this point, I was pushing pretty hard for primary because I was pretty sure that my opponent, if they were able to get a bead on one of the Hive Tyrants, could kill it and score a whole boatload of secondary points. So I needed those primary points to bring the game into my favor. My opponent scored 10 points for their primary, but because all of their fast elements were removed, they're basically just moving, everybody 6 inches a turn, sort of slowly plodding up the table, so they weren't able to do too much. My Termagants on objective 4 ended up surviving against all their shooting. Catalyst really helped out, and I was able to make a bunch of catalyst saves, as well as the -1 to hit, essentially canceling out their bonus from my will be done. Also had some abysmal shooting from my opponent, shooting into the Hormigants by objective 1 on my left-hand side of the table. Only killed one of them with 20 Necron Warrior shots. I rolled some good saves, and on top of that, the -1 to hit really crushed them. And those guys were going to be able to survive for another turn to score me some more engage on all fronts. So that was pretty lucky. Moving over to my turn, fortunately holding all of those objectives meant that I was able to score the big 15 on Battle Round 4, which is pretty useful, as well as continuing to push up the engage on all fronts score. Things were moving pretty quickly at this point because most of our armies weren't really fighting. We were just kind of hiding and trying to kite each other, which is a pretty interesting tactical game, but not a lot of models being killed. I did end up taking out the Immortals, though, between some Smites and a Hive Guard shooting at them. So that was an OBSEC unit in the center of the table that my opponent was not going to be able to move to go and contest Objective 4, which I was thankful for. So moving on to Battle Round 5, my opponent moved over to try to knock me off some of the objectives and run up their rank score. They were able to kill a bunch of the Termagants, including one of the units on the right-hand side that was trailing between the two objectives, and killing off my Hormigants on the left-hand side. Finally, those guys stopped making some insane 6s for armor saves, so that was pretty good for my opponent. Back to my turn, I maxed out my primary objective points, scoring the full 45 by holding all those objectives at the start of the turn, and just went to try to score some secondaries. A Cryptek had moved up relatively close to me, so I was able to double move a Hive Tyrant into them, and knock them off for an additional 3 Assassinate points, and using Metabolic Overdrive, I was able to get a unit of Hormigants all the way onto this quarter of the table in order to score another round of Engage on all fronts. So that meant, in the final tally of the game, I was able to max out my primaries with 45 primary objective points, whereas my opponent was only able to score 35. He had that one turn of 5-point scoring, whereas I had one turn of 15, and that really clinched it for me there. In terms of secondaries, I was able to actually pull ahead. My opponent got 6 points for Bring It Down, as well as 8 points for Thin Their Ranks, killing a whole boatload of Termagants, as well as getting the points from killing the 2 Exocrines. That put my opponent at a total of 49 points, whereas I was able to score 10 points for completing my Deploy Scramblers, an additional 10 points for Engage on all fronts, and 6 points for Assassinate, for a grand total of 71 victory points, giving me a Tyranid victory. Now, all in all, obviously, I'm pretty happy with how the game went, given that I was able to pull out a win going second. I do think that my opponent was playing a little cagier than he needed to. I really felt like I was able to command a lot more table space than I realistically should have in a game going second with GT2020. My opponent is able to do, especially with Relentlessly Expansionist, is push 11 inches up the table on each side. Because the objectives are sort of split between 2 table halves, I think it's pretty good for my opponent to sit a block of 20 warriors on each objective and just sort of force them through the center of the table and hold the center objectives. That means that I don't have the ability to push up into his table edge quite as much as I did. So I do think my opponent was playing a little bit cagier than they needed to, and castling on that left-hand side of the table I don't think was the right call on my opponent's part. Obviously, I also think that sending the flyer in so far immediately was probably a little bit of a mistake. The Doom Scythe could potentially just use its maneuverability to kite for a couple turns, and there's not really much I can do about it. The Exocrines don't shoot that super far. With the -1 to hit, it's unlikely that I one-round it with shooting, and if they stay out of the range of the Hive Guard, there's not, I don't really have any recourse for that. Unless I can get a Hive Tyrant double moved in to kill it, it's just going to be able to keep shooting its Big Death Laser Beam for the entire game. But sending it in meant that I could kill it in melee pretty easily, so I was pretty happy that I was going to be able to pick that up. Now, on the flip side, obviously the Doomsday Arc is a big problem for me. I can't really deal with that, especially with the long-range gun. I do think my opponent played it, again, relatively cagily by moving it around the table to kite the threat range of the Hive Guard, so they weren't ever able to hit it. But on the flip side, that meant that it wasn't really taking optimal shots a lot of times. It was shooting into Termagants that were -1 to hit, and I think we had a running joke where almost every turn it would fire, it would kill one model. So having your 200-point tank only shoot one 5-point Termagant to death every turn is a little bit disappointing. So I think I would have liked to see that, especially with the Relentlessly Expansionist move, which you basically get for free, just sort of shove onto this right-hand side of the table. So it gets good, clean lines of sight through the center, and it threatens being able to see onto this, onto this objective, because that means that it would be able to fire into the Hive Tyrants that were hiding behind this L here, and I couldn't really hide them forever. Now that does mean the Doomsday Ark might die, but I didn't take Bring It Down. So you don't lose anything if I kill it, and in fact you may gain something by forcing me to trade a Hive Tyrant for it. On my end, I do think I made some mistakes. I don't think that I needed to back deploy my Hormagaunts as much as I did. I kept some Termagants sort of in the back so they weren't able to get hit by the double tapping Gauss Flares immediately. That was probably, in hindsight, the right call, but the Hormagaunts were way too far back. I don't know what they were doing. And that made it a little bit difficult for me to score Engage in all fronts early. I think I could have had a situation where I could have Metabolic Overdrive the unit in and just suicide them into the center to block off board space for the Deep Strikers and then also score Engage in all fronts, and I ended up not doing that. So I think I could have just deployed the Hormagaunts on the line, at least on the right-hand flank where my opponent didn't have any warriors, and then use them to rocket up the table to get those engage points earlier. I ended up not scoring Engage in all fronts on turn 1, and I probably could have pretty easily with a double move. That would have gotten me an additional 2 points, potentially. I also was wondering if maybe there was an argument to be made to sort of rear deploy the Exocrines, maybe deploy them pretty far apart so that the Doomsday Ark couldn't get a situation where it could see both of them. It ended up only killing one of them, but I was worried that the placement of both Exocrines, or the concentration of both Exocrines in the middle, I guess, meant that my opponent had pretty easy target prioritization and could just put his big guns so that they could fire into the center. I'm not 100% sure about that. I think the benefit of dense cover was a pretty big deal, and unfortunately the reverse effect also applies, where the Exocrines, if they are hidden out of line of sight, also cannot shoot. So putting them in line of sight just to trade shots with their opponent is probably the most effective play, but I'm not 100% sure. It is very dependent on who goes first. If I go second, especially against the Necron matchup, they're probably just going to get ripped off the table, and there's nothing I can do about it. But if I go first, they can kill a bunch of stuff, potentially knock out a Doomsday Ark or the Doom Scythe before it gets to blow me up. So, I mean, this just in, going first is really good in 9th edition 40k. What a shocker. Now, I did have a lot of fun in this game. My opponent was great, and we had a good time. But I do want to rant a little bit about sort of how the game played out, and just about, I guess, the GT format in general. I really didn't like how many points my opponent was able to get off killing the Hive Tyrants. Now, that's a little bit on me, because my list construction is sort of incentivizes my opponent to take secondaries where you can score a lot of points off of those big monsters, but it does also mean that I'm forced into this extremely cagey game plan, which is, I mean, it's not as fun as I would like. I want the Hive Tyrants to be able to move in and out, play the hit and run game, play more aggressively, use their psychic powers, and unfortunately, doing so meant that I was potentially giving up an immense amount of points on secondary objectives, and it's just not super exciting. I don't like that I have to do the calculus of how many points my opponent can score off killing my models versus how many points they can get. I'm not a big fan of the fact that my opponent can score 3 times as many points for killing my characters than I can score off theirs. And given the fact that their characters are a lot harder to get, means that I have to basically overextend the Tyrants in order to be able to do that. Now, I think this may just be a problem with Tyrants specifically, but I think, honestly, it's more of a problem with Abhor the Witch and the fact that it stacks with not only Thin the Ranks, but also Bring It Down, and can really compound issues like that. Abhor the Witch is, I mean, it's just it's a poorly designed secondary. There's a lot of factions in the game that cannot play without Psychers. Their entire faction is designed around the use of Psychers, and so there's just this really powerful secondary that is not open to you, but that you then give up to your opponent. And Tyranids are one of those. There's not many Tyranid lists you can play without 3 Psychers in them. A lot of like random combat characters in Tyranids are randomly Psychers and will randomly give up before the Witch points, whereas a lot of factions in the game either do not have Psychers at all, which means that Abhor the Witch isn't a big deal, or their Psychers aren't very important to them. So things like Space Marines, they don't need Abhor the Witch. They can leave the Librarians at home, just take Chaplains, which are effectively the same thing but better, and then score a billion points for killing enemy characters. It's, I guess, I don't know if I have a point here. So beyond that, I think the secondary system in the GT packet is not very good, but it was frustrating to sort of have to sideline like 700 points of my army because my opponent was able to score secondaries so well off of them. In hindsight, maybe that's a reason to change the list. I really like the Hive Tyrants just from on a personal standpoint, so I like playing them, and I don't know if I'm going to remove them from the list for that reason, but we'll see how it goes. I'm having a lot of fun with it, but having to play sort of a tactical game like that is not super exciting. Anyway, that's going to be it for this battle report, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know down in the comments below if you enjoy this style of content and the style of battle report, and I'll try to do more. I don't get too many games in real life of 40k right now. Unfortunately, quarantine is still active in my area. Local game stores aren't really hosting game nights too often, and I maybe only get to play once every couple weeks in real life. I'm mostly on Tabletop Simulator right now, but if you enjoy this sort of photography style battle report, let me know and I'll try to get some more real life games in. Thanks again for watching, everybody. Big thanks to my patrons up on the screen right now for supporting. You can join them at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, and we have a cool YouTube membership that you can join at the link down below the video next to the subscribe button. Thanks again, everyone, for watching. Have a good one, keep it classy, and remember to have happy wargaming.